The architect of Cedar Hill, I spent 4 years designing the building that was going to save my grandfather's neighborhood, and the morning it was supposed to break ground, I was arrested in front of the whole city for a crime I didn't commit, while the man who framed me stood behind the cameras and smiled. If you've ever built something with everything you had and watched a powerful man try to bury you under it, stay with me, because the way this ended is the reason I can tell it. And before we begin, do me one favor, hit subscribe, because the people who fight for a place nobody else will fight for deserve to have their story finished. My name is Julian. I'm an architect, and for a long time I believed that was a neutral thing to be, that buildings were just buildings, steel and glass and math. I know better now. A building is an argument about who a place is for. And the building at the center of this story was the loudest argument I ever made, which is exactly why a man with more money than God decided to destroy me rather than let it stand. I grew up in a neighborhood called Cedar Hill on the south end of Seattle, in a house my grandfather built with his own hands after the war, on one of the few blocks where a black family was allowed to buy in those days. Cedar Hill was redlined, then ignored, then when the city finally grew hungry enough, discovered, which is the word people use when they mean a place full of people is about to be emptied of them. My grandfather raised my mother in that house, and my mother raised me in it, and I used to sit on his porch and listen to him name every family on the block and tell me what they'd survived to get there. He died when I was in architecture school, and I promised him at his funeral that I would come back and build something in Cedar Hill that said in stone, we were here and we are not leaving. I earned my way to that promise the long road. I was the only black student in most of my studios. I heard more times than I can count that my work was interesting in the tone people use when they mean surprising. I worked at 3 firms where I designed the best projects and watched white colleagues present them. I raised a child through those years, mostly alone after my wife passed. My son is grown now, an engineer out east, and I raised him in that same Cedar Hill house. And being the father who stays taught me the patience it takes to fight a thing that fights back slowly. Eventually, I did what men like me have to do to be taken seriously. I started my own firm, small, scrappy, with my grandfather's name on it. Cross and grandfather, my son used to joke. It was just me and 2 young designers and a whole lot of stubbornness. And then the city put out a call that changed everything. Cedar Hill's old library, a beautiful crumbling wreck my grandfather had checked books out of, was to be replaced. The city wanted a new civic building on the site, a library and cultural center, the anchor of the neighborhood, and they opened it to design competition. I entered, a tiny firm against giants, and I did not design them a building. I designed them Cedar Hill itself, a structure that held the memory of the neighborhood in its bones, with a facade that used the brick of the demolished homes the city had already started clearing, with a great reading room oriented to the exact light that fell across my grandfather's porch, with the names of the founding families carved where everyone could see them. I made an argument in steel and glass that Cedar Hill's people were the point of Cedar Hill. I have to tell you about the day I presented that design, because it was the moment I stopped being a small firm architect scraping for scraps and became a man with something worth destroying. The competition jury expected a slideshow of renderings. Instead, I brought a single brick, a real one, salvaged from one of the Cedar Hill houses the city had already cleared, still gray with a century of somebody's family. I set it on the table in front of the jury, and I said, this was somebody's wall. A man laid it by hand so his children would have somewhere the world couldn't tell them to leave. The city has a pile of these where a neighborhood used to be. I'm not proposing we forget them. I'm proposing we build them into the front of the new library so that every child who walks in walks past the actual homes of the people who came before them. The room was silent for a long moment. Then an old juror, an architect. I'd admired my whole career, picked up the brick and turned it over in her hands, and I watched her decide. That brick won it. Not my drawings, the truth the drawings were carrying. I won. A little firm with an old man's name on it beat the giants. And for about a week, I was the story everyone in Seattle wanted to tell the local boy who came home to build a monument to his own people. It was the proudest week of my life. It was also, though I didn't know it yet, the week I made a permanent enemy of the most dangerous man in the city. His name was Garrett Voss. Voss was a developer, the biggest on the West Coast, the man whose glass towers had replaced half the neighborhoods that used to have names like Cedar Hill. And Cedar Hill was to Garrett Voss the last unclaimed square on the board. I had spent years quietly buying up property around the old library site, assembling the parcels for an enormous luxury development towers, a shopping podium, the whole machine that turns a neighborhood into an address. And the one thing standing between Garrett Voss and his development was the civic building, my civic building. Because a beloved public cultural center anchored in the neighborhood's history with the founding family's names carved in the stone is very hard to bulldoze in 10 years when you want the whole block. My building wasn't just a library to Voss, it was a wall across his future. And Garrett Voss did not tolerate walls. He came to me first the way they always come first, as a friend. He invited me to his office at the top of one of his towers, poured me a drink worth more than my monthly payroll, and told me he admired my work, that he wanted to partner. He offered to fund the civic building himself to make it bigger and grander if I would agree to let it be part of a larger vision. His development, his towers, my little library reduced to an amenity at the base of them, the founding family's names moved somewhere quieter. He offered me more money than my firm had ever seen. And I understood, sitting up in that glass tower looking down at the neighborhood, he wanted to erase that he was offering to buy my grandfather's promise and turn it into marketing. I told him no. I told him the building was for Cedar Hill, and Cedar Hill was not for sale. And Garrett Voss smiled the way powerful men smile when you've just told them something they've decided not to believe, and he said, "Everyone thinks that, Julian, right up until they find out what it costs to mean it." He said one more thing before I left that office, and I didn't understand it until the handcuffs, but I've never forgotten it. Hubble walked me to the window, to that view down over the whole city, all the neighborhoods that used to have names and now had his towers, and he said, "You see all that? Every one of those was somebody's Cedar Hill. Every one of them had a man like you who thought his little piece of the world wasn't for sale. I'm not a villain, Julian. I'm just the last person standing in every one of those stories, and there's a reason it's always me. I understand something you don't. Nobody remembers the man who wouldn't sell. They just remember the building that got built." He was telling me exactly who he was and exactly what he intended, and he was so certain of the ending that he told me the whole thing to my face. I have thought many times since about how badly he wanted to be right about that nobody remembers the man who wouldn't sell. The whole rest of this story is the answer I got to give him. I found out what it costs. It started small, the way it always does. My permits. Got tangled reviews that should have taken weeks stretched into months, objections appearing from city offices. I'd never dealt with each one, just plausible enough to be legal and just slow enough to bleed a small firm dry. This is the part people don't understand about how the powerful actually fight. So let me be clear about it. They almost never do anything that looks illegal from the outside. They just make the ordinary machinery of the city grind against you and only you. A permit that takes everyone else 3 weeks takes you 7 months. An inspection, everyone else passes, you fail on a technicality nobody's enforced in a decade. A grant everyone else receives on schedule develops in your case alone. Mysterious questions. Each single thing is deniable. Each single thing is just process. But when every gear in the whole machine turns against one man at once, that's not process. That's a hand on the machine. And I could feel the hand, I just couldn't photograph it, and you cannot take a feeling to court. I spent a year trying to fight it, the honest way, meetings, appeals, patient letters, doing everything right, believing that if I just followed the rules cleanly enough, the rules would eventually protect me. They didn't. That's the hardest lesson in this whole story, and I'll give it to you plainly. The rules do not protect you from a man who owns the people who enforce the rules. I watched my firm's savings drain into a fight against fog. My 2 young designers, loyal as they were, had rent and families, and one day I had to sit them down and tell them I couldn't make payroll and watch them try not to cry and understand that Voss was winning without ever once showing his face. By the time the arrest came, he'd already spent a year hollowing me out, so that when he finally struck, there'd be nothing left to absorb the blow. Then the financing for the civic building, which the city was assembling from public bonds and grants, started developing mysterious problems. Questions raised by council members, I later learned, had taken a great deal of money from entities connected to Garrett Voss. The project that had made me the pride of Seattle began quietly to stall, and every time I traced a stall back to its source, the trail disappeared into the fog of Voss's money. But Garrett Voss was not a patient man, and stalling wasn't enough for him. He didn't just want the building delayed. He wanted me gone, so thoroughly disgraced that no one would ever let me rebuild it. And so he did the thing that nearly ended me. The civic building's budget ran through my firm, millions in public money, dispersed to contractors and consultants with me as the architect of record signing off. It's a normal arrangement and a dangerous one because it means a lot of money moves under your name. And one morning, 4 years into the fight, on the very day we were finally against all odds supposed to break ground, I arrived at the site in a suit with my mother in the front row and half the neighborhood there to watch. And instead of a groundbreaking, there were police. They arrested me in front of the cameras, embezzlement, fraud, misuse of public funds. Someone had constructed a paper trail showing that hundreds of thousands of dollars of the project's public money had been funneled through shell accounts back to me. It was fabricated, every dollar of it, but it was beautifully fabricated professional work, and it was enough to arrest a man in front of his own mother and his grandfather's whole neighborhood on the proudest morning of his life. The thing I remember most about that morning isn't the handcuffs, it's my mother's face. She was 71 years old, sitting in the front row in the good dress she'd bought special, holding the program with my name on it. And she'd waited her whole life to watch her son break ground on a building with her father's name in the cornerstone. And instead, she watched two officers walk up to me at the podium in front of everyone and turn me around and put my hands behind my back. She didn't cry out. She just stood up slowly in that front row, and she looked at me, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to disappear into the ground. Not for myself, but because a man had chosen that specific morning, my mother in that specific dress, to do this, and I understood that the cruelty of the timing was the point. Voss could have arrested me any day. He chose the groundbreaking. He wanted the photograph. He wanted my mother in the frame. I want you to understand what that morning did. It didn't just stop the building. It turned the entire story inside out. Yesterday, I was the local boy who came home to build a monument to his people. Today, I was another black man who'd gotten his hands on public money and stolen it, the oldest and ugliest story this country knows how to tell. And Garrett Voss had written it perfectly because he understood that a great many people were already half ready to believe it. The city suspended the project pending investigation. My firm's other contracts evaporated overnight. My designers who had families had to leave. And the neighborhood that had celebrated me looked at the headlines and didn't know what to think, which is exactly what Voss wanted, because a hero the neighborhood is unsure about cannot lead them against anything. I sat in a holding cell that first night, 46 years old. My grandfather's name on a firm that no longer had any clients, and I understood the completeness of it. Voss hadn't just blocked the wall across his future. He'd made it so that when the civic building died and his towers rose in its place, the story people would tell was that Cedar Hill's own library had failed because the man they'd trusted had robbed them. He was going to steal the neighborhood and make its own grief the cover story. It was, I have to admit, the most elegant destruction I have ever seen, and it was aimed entirely at me. The woman who refused to let it work was the one person on the project Garrett Voss had forgotten to account for because she wasn't the kind of person men like him bother to account for. Her name was Nora Keegan. She was the structural engineer on the civic building, a brilliant, blunt, red-haired woman from a family of Irish ironworkers. The kind of engineer who'd walk a construction site at dawn and know by the sound of it whether the steel was right. She'd been hired onto the project separately by the city, not by me, and we'd spent 2 years arguing productively about cantilevers and load paths, the specific intimacy of two people building the same thing from different ends. I respected her more than almost anyone I'd worked with, but we weren't close. She was a professional wall of competence, and I was a man consumed by a promise, and there hadn't been room for anything else. She came to see me the day I made bail. She didn't offer sympathy. She sat down across from me and put a folder on the table, and she said, "I've spent 2 years auditing every load on that building. I audit numbers for a living, Julian. It's the only thing I actually trust. And when I heard what they arrested you for, the first thing I did was pull the project's financial disbursements, because numbers don't lie even when everyone around them does. And these numbers lie. Whoever built this paper trail was good, but they weren't an engineer. They made errors. An auditor sees and a prosecutor doesn't. I can prove some of these transactions are impossible. The question is whether you've got the stomach to fight a man who can do this." She gestured at the folder at the whole ruined morning. "Because I'm not going to build a case just to watch you quit." I looked at Nora Keegan, and for the first time since the handcuffs, I felt something other than the weight. I said I had the stomach. She said, "Good, then let's do what I do best. Let's read the numbers until they tell us who really touched them." And that's exactly what she did night after night for months, in a way that still astonishes me. Nora treated that fabricated paper trail the way she'd treat a suspect building. She didn't argue with it. She load tested it. She'd take a single transaction and ask the boring, relentless questions an engineer asks of a beam. When exactly signed by whom, from where, on what device? Does that time exist in the other records? Could the man they say did this have physically done it at that hour? And one by one the transactions failed the test. A wire I supposedly authorized from my office at 9:40 on a Tuesday morning, except the construction log stamped by a city inspector put me in a trailer across town at a mandatory site walk at 9:40 that same Tuesday, with Nora standing next to me. A signature on a disbursement dated a full week before the shell account that received it was even opened. Small things, fatal things. Nora used to say that liars build beautiful facades and forget the foundation because they've never actually had to carry a load in their lives. Garrett Voss had spent a fortune on a gorgeous, professional, convincing lie, and it could not survive one honest engineer asking it to hold weight. Here is what we built in the year that followed the architect and the engineer from nothing but the truth and the arithmetic. Nora was right. The fabrication was professional, but not perfect, and an engineer's eye for what's structurally possible turned out to be exactly the eye that could see the cracks. The shell accounts the money supposedly flowed through had been created and had transactions time-stamped at moments when I could prove from the project's own construction logs that I was somewhere else entirely doing something else entirely, often with Nora herself as a witness. The paper trail had me approving disbursements from an account on days the account didn't yet exist. It was a building with no foundation, and Nora Keegan spent a lifetime knowing that a building with no foundation, however beautiful, falls the moment you put real weight on it. We just had to find the weight. The weight was the money's true path, because fabricated money still has to come from somewhere and go somewhere real. Nora's cousin was a forensic accountant, and when the three of us followed the actual dollars, not the fake trail pointing at me, but the real flows underneath it, they led through a chain of shells and consultants and a very expensive law firm back toward entities that led eventually toward Garrett Voss. The same man who tried to buy my building had paid to fabricate the crime that would kill it, but knowing it and proving it to people who could act on it, whereas I'd learned before 2 different countries, and the ocean between them was as always made of Voss's money and Voss's friends. He fought us the whole way, and the fighting showed me the full shape of him. When he learned Nora was helping me, pressure came down on her from directions. An engineer shouldn't feel it from a professional licensing complaint. Out of nowhere, a whisper campaign that she was compromised for working with an accused fraud. A sudden coldness from firms that used to hire her. He was doing to her exactly what he'd done to me, turning her competence into a liability, betting she'd protect her career by walking away. She framed the licensing complaint and hung it over her desk, which is when I understood she and I were built out of the same material. When our investigation started getting close, one of the council members who'd taken Voss's money tried to have the whole civic building formally canceled and the site released for private development on an emergency basis, a naked attempt to complete the theft before the truth could stop it. And there was a night, my grandfather's house, the house he built with his hands, the house I still lived in, was broken into and my project files gone through, a message left in the disorder stop, or we can reach you where you live. That was the night I nearly folded standing in my grandfather's ransacked living room. And that was the night Nora Keegan, who had come to check on me, stood in that same room and said the thing that carried me the rest of the way. "He broke into the wrong house, Julian. This is the house your grandfather built, so a man like Voss couldn't tell your family where they could stand. You want to honor him? Don't move an inch." And the neighborhood came back to me. That was the thing Voss never saw coming, because he thought of Cedar Hill as property, and property doesn't fight back. But Cedar Hill was people, and people remember. For a few weeks after the arrest, the headlines had done their work. I felt it when I walked to the corner store, the way old neighbors' eyes slid off me. Not with hatred, but with that terrible uncertainty Voss had engineered. And then an old woman named Miss Beatrice Coleman, who had known my grandfather, who had checked out books from the old library beside him 70 years ago, called a meeting at her church. She was nearly 90 and she ran that meeting like a general. She stood up in front of the whole neighborhood and she said, "I have watched this city take black neighborhoods my entire life, and every single time they told us a story first about why the people who live there didn't deserve to. Every time. And here it is again, right on schedule, the week before Julian Cross was going to give us back our library. You think that's an accident? I knew that boy's grandfather. I knew that boy in short pants. And I know a setup when the same men who've been trying to buy this block for years suddenly find a reason he's a criminal." That old woman turned the tide in one speech because she'd seen the play run enough times to name it before it finished. Cedar Hill Organized. A young community organizer named Marcus Webb. No relation to me, but he took to calling me cousin, and I let him because that's how the neighborhood worked. Pulled the elders and the churches and the block clubs together, and they started showing up to my court dates, to city council meetings demanding to know why the civic building was stalling and who was benefiting. They packed the chamber the night Voss's council allies tried to quietly cancel the project, and they made a cancellation that was supposed to happen in the dark, happen in front of 100 angry witnesses and 3 television cameras instead. You cannot bury a neighborhood that has decided to be loud. Voss had counted on Cedar Hill's silence the same way every developer before him had counted on it, and Cedar Hill, led by a 90-year-old woman with a 70-year memory, declined to be silent. That gave Nora and me the one thing we most needed, which was time, because a project the public is watching cannot be quietly killed, and a man the public is defending cannot be quietly disappeared. The break came, as it always does, from the people. The powerful are certain will stay silent. The fabrication had been too professional to be Voss's own work. He'd hired it done, and the people who do that kind of work are people who have themselves been used and discarded and are not in the end loyal to the men who pay them. Nora's cousin traced the fabrication to a financial consultant Voss had employed and then characteristically stopped protecting once the heat rose. When a very good federal prosecutor named Diane Okonkwo, who it turned out had been trying to build a case against Garrett Voss's development empire for years and had never been able to get inside it, got a look at what Nora and I had assembled, she understood that we'd handed her the thing she'd been missing. Specific, provable, documented crime with Voss's money running through it. And once the prosecutor moved, and once the consultant understood he was going to prison for a rich man who'd already begun to abandon him, the consultant did what such people do. He gave them Voss. Not the master at first, the middlemen, but the middlemen gave the master, because that is how these structures always come down from the bottom. One frightened brick at a time. It took a year, and it cost me nearly everything I had left. But in the end, the fabricated case against me didn't just collapse. It reversed and became the single most damning piece of evidence against the man who'd built it, because a fabricated crime once exposed is itself a crime, and a far worse one. The embezzlement charges against me were dismissed with prejudice. And Garrett Voss, the biggest developer on the West Coast, the man whose towers had erased a dozen neighborhoods, the man who'd smiled behind the cameras while they arrested me on the proudest morning of my life, was indicted for fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy. The council members who'd taken his money went down with him. The whole quiet machine that had been assembling Cedar Hill for demolition came apart in the light, its bribes and its shells and its fabricated paper trail laid out in a federal courtroom for the whole city to see. I testified at Voss's trial. I want to tell you about the one moment I got back what he'd taken on that groundbreaking morning. His attorney tried to do to me on the stand what the headlines had done to me in the street. Paint me as a struggling architect who'd resented a successful man, a bitter failure who'd invented a conspiracy to explain his own crime. He asked me with that manicured contempt whether it wasn't true that my firm was nearly bankrupt, whether I hadn't been desperate, whether desperate men don't do desperate things. And I looked at the jury, and then at Miss Beatrice Coleman in the second row, 90 years old, and watching me the way she'd once watched my grandfather, and I said, "Yes, I was nearly bankrupt. I spent 4 years and every dollar I had designing a library for a neighborhood your client wanted to erase because I made a promise to a man who built his own house by hand in a city that told him where he was allowed to live. I wasn't desperate for money. I was desperate to keep that promise. Your client couldn't tell the difference between those two things, and that's the whole reason he's sitting where he's sitting." The room went quiet, and for the first time since the cameras and the handcuffs, I watched Garrett Voss look down at the table instead of at me. There was a moment, too, that the reporters all wrote about afterward. When the verdict came in guilty on every count that mattered, Voss turned in his seat and found me in the gallery, and for just a second, the smile came back. That patient rich man's smile that said, "This isn't over. I have appeals. I have money. I'll outlast you." And Miss Beatrice Coleman, 90 years old, stood up in the gallery, slow and deliberate, and looked right back at him, and she didn't say a word. She just stood the way people stand when they have decided you are going to have to look at them. And one by one, the whole Cedar Hill section of that gallery stood up with her, the elders, the block clubs, the churches, Marcus Webb, my mother, until Garrett Voss was the only person in his half of the room, still sitting, staring up at a neighborhood he'd been certain would never fight all of it on its feet, all of it refusing to look away from him. That was the moment his smile finally died for good. He'd spent his whole life making people disappear. And there they all were standing, impossible to disappear, watching him lose. Garrett Voss was convicted. His development empire, so much of it built on exactly this kind of hidden corruption, did not survive the exposure of how it really worked. And here's the part that still feels like something my grandfather would have wanted me to promise him: the land Voss had assembled around the old library site, the parcels he'd bought to build his towers, went into the wreckage of his companies, and the city, chastened and eager to be on the right side of a scandal it had nearly enabled, put them into a community land trust for Cedar Hill, so that the neighborhood could never be assembled and erased that way again. The wall I'd designed across Voss's future became in the end the foundation of the neighborhoods. The community land trust was Miss Beatrice Coleman's idea in the end. When the wreckage of Voss's empire put all those assembled parcels back on the table, the city assumed they'd just be resold to the next developer, the next Voss, and the cycle would begin again the way it always had. It was Miss Beatrice who stood up at the council meeting, the same chamber where Voss's allies had tried to kill the project in the dark, and said, "You people have handed this neighborhood to a man like that once a generation for 100 years. This time you're going to hand it back to us, and you're going to write it down so nobody can ever take it again." And because the whole city was watching, and because the scandal had made cowards brave, they did. The land went into a trust controlled by Cedar Hill residents, so that the homes and the small shops and the families could never again be quietly assembled and erased by a man with enough money to make the machine grind. It is, I think, the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story, and I didn't design it. A 90-year-old woman did with one sentence in a room full of people who'd spent their lives being told to be quiet. They built my building. 4 years late, through a criminal trial and a ruined firm and a break-in and a year I wouldn't wish on anyone. They finally broke ground on the Cedar Hill Library and Cultural Center, and this time my mother was in the front row, and no one came to arrest me. It stands there now, made partly of the brick of the homes that used to hold my neighbors, its great reading room, turned to catch the light that once fell across my grandfather's porch. The names of the founding families carved in the stone where Garrett Voss wanted to put a valet stand. Children who look like me do their homework in that light. My grandfather's name is on the cornerstone next to mine. I kept the promise. Now I've told you the fight. Let me tell you about Nora, because a building is an argument about who a place is for, and somewhere in that year I learned that a life is the same kind of argument, and that I'd been building mine for no one but a promise until she walked into it. There was one night that changed how I saw her, though I didn't understand it as falling until much later. It was deep in the worst of it, after the break-in, when we were working past 2 in the morning, in her cramped office, cross-referencing the fabricated transactions against the construction logs. I was exhausted and angry, and I said something bitter that maybe the truth didn't matter, that Voss would win, because men like Voss always win, that I was a fool to have ever believed a building could change anything. And Nora put down her pencil and looked at me for a long time, and then she told me about her father, an iron worker who'd fallen from a bridge he was building when she was 12, and how the company had tried to blame him, said he'd been careless, cut corners to avoid paying her family what they owed. And how her mother, who barely finished high school, had spent 2 years teaching herself to read engineering reports at the kitchen table until she could prove the steel had failed. Not the man. She was right, Nora said. The numbers were right. It took 2 years and it nearly killed her, but the truth held because she refused to let them make my father into their excuse. That's why I do what I do, Julian. That's why I read numbers until they confess. Don't you dare tell me the truth doesn't matter. It's the only thing my whole family had, and it was enough. And I looked at this woman who had become an engineer to finish her mother's fight, and I understood that Nora Keegan hadn't taken my case as a favor. She'd taken it because she recognized it. We were both children of people who'd been made into someone's excuse, and neither of us was ever going to let it happen again. We fell in love, the way two people who build things fall in love. Slowly, structurally, load by load, testing each connection before we trusted it with any weight. For most of that year, I didn't let myself feel it, because I was an accused man fighting for my life and she was the steel holding me up. And you don't fall in love with the thing keeping you standing. You just hold on. But somewhere in the long nights of reading numbers until they told the truth in the arguments, and the coffee gone cold and the shared refusal to quit, I stopped seeing Nora Keegan as the engineer on my project and started seeing her as the person I wanted to build the rest of my life beside. She was the most competent person I'd ever met and the most honest, and she'd put her whole career on the line to prove a truth about a man the world had already decided to believe the worst of, and she'd never once done it like she was doing me a favor. She never let me be grateful, which is how I knew. When I tried in my careful way to thank her for saving me, she looked up from a set of drawings and said, "Julian, I didn't save you. I read the numbers, and the numbers said you were telling the truth, and I'm not in the habit of walking away from a true thing because a rich man finds it inconvenient. That's not loyalty to you. That's loyalty to the truth. You just happen to be standing where the truth is." And I looked at this woman who trusted numbers because people had failed her, and who had decided to trust me because the numbers vouched for me, and I understood that the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me was an engineer telling me my foundation was sound. The night the cultural center opened after the speeches in the crowd and my mother crying in the reading room, Nora and I stood alone under the carved names of the founding families, in the light my grandfather used to sit in, and I told her the truth. I'd been too busy surviving to say that she was the only person I'd ever met who'd looked at me when everyone else looked away, and that I wanted to spend the rest of my life proving that the two of us built things that lasted. And Nora Keegan, who does not cry, got something in her eyes she'd deny to this day, and she said, "Well, let's check the load path." And then she kissed me under the names of my grandfather's neighbors in a building a rich man tried to bury me under, and it held. She's my partner now in the firm and in the house my grandfather built, which we rebuilt together after the break-in better than before. Nora redesigned the whole frame herself, and she likes to say it'll outlast the both of us, which from an engineer is the closest thing to a love poem you'll ever get. We were married in the reading room of the Cultural Center under the carved names of the founding families, with Miss Beatrice Coleman in the front row, where my grandfather should have been, and Marcus Webb and my mother and the two young designers I'd once had to lay off, both of whom I hired back the day the firm had money again. Cross and Keegan, the sign says now, and we only take the work that argues for the people. Other people are trying to erase, and there is more of that work than you'd think, and we are never short of a fight. We started a fellowship, too, out of the money. We won from the fabricated charges suit for young architects from neighborhoods like Cedar Hill. The ones who hear that their work is interesting, in that particular tone, the ones who have to start their own firms because no one will hand them the good projects. Garrett Voss is where he belongs, and the neighborhood he tried to steal belongs at last, an in-law to itself, and will for every generation that comes after. My grandfather never got to see the library, but my mother sat in the reading room the day it opened in the same good dress she'd worn to the groundbreaking that ended in handcuffs, and she watched the afternoon light come across the floor exactly the way it used to come across her father's porch. And she told me it was the first time since that morning that she'd felt the world set itself right. I think that's what buildings are actually for. Not the awards, not the magazine covers Voss chased his whole life. Just that, a place where the light falls the right way, where the names are carved, where children can see them, where a 71-year-old woman can sit in a dress and feel that the people she came from were not after all erased. They arrested me in front of the whole city for building something that said my people were here and were not leaving. A man with more money than God was certain that would be the end of me because it had been the end of so many before me. But my grandfather built a house so that his family would always have somewhere to stand, and an engineer taught me that a lie is a building with no foundation, and a neighborhood taught me that you cannot erase people who refuse to be erased, and the wall they tried to bury me under is standing in the light right now, with all our names carved into it, arguing in stone forever that we were here. If this story built something in you, do me that favor from the start. Subscribe so the people who fight for a place nobody else will fight for always have somewhere their story gets finished. And tell me in the comments, is there a place you'd fight this hard to save? I read every single one. And stay close. The next story I've got for you begins with a phone call at midnight and a debt that was never supposed to come due, and it will keep you to the very last word.